We turn now to Florida Democratic Congressman Maxwell Frost. He joins us from Orlando. Welcome to Face the Nation.
Thanks for having me on.
Congressman, President Biden is in Florida today to assess damage from Hurricane Milton. At least 60 Democratic lawmakers, some from Florida, have called for Congress to immediately return to Washington to vote for aid. You haven't joined that call. Why?
I believe I have joined that call, but if not, I do believe that Congress needs to return to make sure that we pass money for more aid.
How immediately do you need that to happen? How in need is your community?
Our community is very much in need across Florida, but the thing we have to understand is, yes, FEMA has the resources necessary to deal with the current situation. But like was mentioned in the previous segment, NOAA is predicting, and we've seen that this is one of the worst hurricane seasons we've seen, and we're not done with this hurricane season. It doesn't end really till the end of November, and so I think it is important. Why leave up to chance when we can ensure that FEMA has the resources it needs? And not just FEMA, SBA also has a program, and different agencies have programs that help us respond to these hurricanes. Why would we leave it up to chance and wait till something happens when we can make sure that we do that work now? Especially when a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are working at politicizing these storms when we can actually do something about it.
So you need this vote to happen before Congress is set to return November 12th, or you can wait until November 12th?
I think we should do it as soon as possible. Why
Okay.
wait until November 12th? We don't know what's going to be happening in terms of natural disasters or storms. I think it's important that
Yep.
a agency like FEMA have even not just what they
Okay.
need, but even more than what they need to ensure that they have the
I've,
resources necessary, of course, to help with the current
I've got it.
operation, which they
I've got
have,
to
but also with future
take a
things.
break here, Congressman, and continue our conversation on the other side of the commercial. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return to our conversation with Florida Congressman Maxwell Frost. Congressman, you are the youngest member of Congress, it looks like, and you've been on college campuses trying to shore up support for Vice President Harris. In our CBS polling from earlier this summer, before Harris entered the race, we did see among 40% of young people who responded, they said politics over the last few years makes them feel like there's nothing else they can do. Another 40% said they want to tune out and watch something else. Young people may not be apathetic, but they certainly don't seem to be excited about the political system as a way to affect change. How do you change that?
Well, I appreciate the question, and it's not just up to me, right? It's up to all of our leaders, all of our organizers, people on the ground to make sure that young people understand that if they step away from their civic power that they have, there's people who don't have their best interests at heart that are more than happy to step into that power for them. I mean, you mentioned, a number that comes before Kamala Harris being the top of our ticket. I've seen, as I've traveled this country, did a back to school tour just a few weeks ago, a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around this election, especially with young voters wanting to vote for Kamala Harris. And, there's this notion that young people are not being involved in the political system, and we can do better, but people should know that young people are voting at the highest numbers in our country's history. 2020 was the highest youth voter turnout in the history of our country. 2018 and 2022 are the highest youth voter turnout in a midterm in the history of our country too. So we're trending in the right direction. We just need to continue to reach out to young people and not take those votes for granted.
Right, and there's that question of enthusiasm actually translating to votes. You've said vibes don't mean votes, I saw you say. On another issue that we know is of concern to the Harris campaign, I want to ask you about remarks that former President Barack Obama made earlier this week. He was speaking to campaign volunteers in Pittsburgh, and he raised the concern about low enthusiasm and turnout, specifically among Black men. He said, quote, "Part of it makes me think that, well, you just aren't feeling the idea of having a woman as president." Do you share the former president's concern that this is a dynamic impacting the race? How much of an issue is it for Vice President Harris?
I think it is an issue with a lot of different voters across this country, and it's something that our country, we've come a long way as in terms of women's suffrage. We've come a long way in terms of making sure of equity in this country, but there's still a lot of this bigotry in this country in terms of sexism, in terms of racism, and we still have to work at getting over that. Those things are still here. They still exist in a lot of communities, and we still have a lot of work to do here. And so I think President Obama was just having some very serious, tough talk, right? Tough love with a lot of, especially, he was speaking directly to young Black voters, young Black men specifically, and making sure that they understand, look, sometimes you have to take a step back and look at your own bias. What's the bias you have? What are the real reasons you're voting against someone or for someone? Is it a legitimate policy thing, or does it have to do more with the vibe of something? And then look more into that as well. I think it's really important. This like politics of vibes, we see it a lot here in Florida with someone like Ron DeSantis, who claims to be someone who's for the people and for democracy, yet every chance he gets, he acts like an authoritarian. Then I go to voters who have family members who've escaped countries with authoritarian leaders, and I ask them, why are you voting for someone who's emulating what your parents escaped? And they can't quite explain it. It has to do with the vibes, with the atmosphere the politician has created. And I think we still have to contend with that as a country, and that's what the president was talking about.
Congressman, thank you for sharing your insights. We're going to have to leave it there for today. We'll be right back. For more on the race for the White House and our latest poll, we're joined now by CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, the polling shows already close race has tightened further. Why is that?
Let me start by reminding people just how tight this is. When you look at our estimates across each and every one of the battleground states, one after another is effectively even. So it's a race that either candidate can and may win. But one reason I think this week was highlighted is that you see how differently these candidates and their supporters define what is, not just what ought to be going forward. Let me show you a couple of different examples. Start with the debate over hurricane relief. Trump supporters say that they believe hurricane relief is not going to people impacted by the hurricane. In fact, they accept the claim that FEMA money was diverted to people in the country illegally. And Harris voters say speed of FEMA was just about right and that aid is going to people impacted. But that's just one example. Take another, the economy. Harris voters say that the economy is largely good. They say, or are more likely to say, that the stock market is up this year, that the U.S. has been adding jobs. Trump voters much less likely to say those things. And one more example, the border. Harris voters say that crossings of the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, are down. Trump voters say that crossings are up. So what that does is it all underpins this idea. It's not just competing ideologies going forward. It's different views of what is right now in the country.
There's no agreed upon set of facts. So,
yeah, exactly.
On things that are measurable, arguably. So if they get their information differently, who do these individuals trust to provide it to them?
We started by asking people how much they use social media. And both camps, both Trump and Harris voters, do use it. They don't necessarily trust everything they see on it. But one thing they say is that they feel social media makes it easier for them to find people that they agree with. And that's a reminder to everyone, when we look at the role of information, it's not just that people are maybe getting right or wrong things or are steered in a different direction. It's that sometimes they very affirmatively go out and look for things that reinforce existing beliefs. The other part is look at sources of information. For Trump voters, Donald Trump is a trusted source of information, as much as their family and friends, and more than a lot of, let's call them experts. But they're not as trusting across the board of all those things. Whereas Harris voters also trust Harris very much, but they also trust other sources like the ones that I mentioned across the board. One thing we saw that both camps share is they're concerned about foreign interference, that foreign countries are trying to influence them, the voters, to try to steer this election. And what tends to happen is each camp thinks that Iran, China, Russia wants the other candidate to win this. Where all this comes out is when you look ahead, what happens after the results are counted. Donald Trump's voters are more likely than Harris's to say that his camp should challenge the election if he loses. and they're more suspicious that there will be widespread fraud in this election, that's something, talk about different views of what is, that we need to keep an eye on once the race is over.
Interesting. Anthony Salvanto, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. We spoke late last week with a group of voters from all 7 battleground states to discuss the election, their outlook for America's future, and more. How many of you voters are going to cast your ballots for Donald Trump? Okay. Mary, you raised your hand. You are in the very important state of Arizona. What's driving your decision?
Well, my decision is I live right on the border in Yuma, Arizona. And I know in the last 3.5 years, we have had just horrible problems in Yuma with a lot of illegal immigration coming through. Our economy is awful. Yuma's unemployment is 16%. So the economy is a big factor as well. Just a combination of things. Our groceries have gone up. Just everything has just really gone downhill in the last 3.5 years for us in Yuma and Arizona completely.
Cole, you are in Georgia, also a very key state. Why do you plan to vote for Donald Trump?
For me, I do not look necessarily at the candidate specifically, but just the broader party and the direction they're hoping to take America. For me, some of the top 3 issues would definitely be our economy, immigration, and then I would also say, as we've come out of the pandemic, just seeing how the 2 different political parties handled the pandemic. I think Kamala Harris and the Democrats are a little bit too extreme on the issue of abortion. I do not support the idea of allowing abortion at 20 weeks of pregnancy, and certainly not with no restrictions. And so I would prefer candidates who are more aligned with my pro-life position.
Mike, you're in Nevada. You said you will be voting for Donald Trump, but he makes it hard. He makes it hard for you to feel good about that vote. Can you explain what you mean?
You know, there's parts of Donald Trump which I admire and parts of Donald Trump which I cringe, for lack of a better term. And, you know, in the debate when he said, you know, they just asked him, January 6th, would you change anything? I think he had an opportunity there to step up as a leader and take some ownership. People went to jail. I think that would have showed a lot of courage for him to do that. So I like things on the economy, tightening up inflation. Yes, and yes. You know, I think those are the primary issues in this election. You know, as you get into the periphery and just how, you know, he conducts himself, sometimes it's hard to put a Trump side in the front yard based on some of his behaviors.
But you're still doing it. Why?
Well, because I'm a fan of the economy and a fan of success, right? I think there has been no driver in the driver's seat in our economy for the last 3.5 years. And I think we've suffered mightily for it. That drives a lot for me. I don't have to like people personally. I don't have to agree with some of the stuff they do, but I have to, kind of go for the greater good.
Christopher, you are in North Carolina. How are people doing there amidst the fallout from this storm? And what makes you an enthusiastic Republican right now?
I've always been an enthusiastic Republican since I voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980. I've been fortunate enough to be part of Trump's ground campaign in 2016, and I met some very amazing people. I really, really like the maturation process that he's gone through. He got his feet wet in 2016. He learned the hard way. He got tagged a few times. He stepped in it a lot. It's easy to look in the rearview mirror and say could have, should have, and would have. But when you're in the moment, you make the best decisions you can at the time. I trust him to do that. I trust him to make a decision.
But do you, Christopher, ever feel uncomfortable, like Mike said he did, with things that Donald Trump says?
At some times I have, but in this day and age, with what we're being faced with on the global stage, and the not so nice characters that will look for a weak spot in the United States of America to bring her to her knees, I'd rather have in the ocean full of bloody water great white sharks, I'd rather have an orca in there than Flipper protecting me. And I know Donald Trump will get in there and he will fight for us. He may not say what we want to hear, but he will execute on our behalf. And it's obvious. The man nearly died. He took a bullet for us. He got back up again. And you cannot dismiss that. And his instinct was to say, fight. So that right there tells me this man doesn't have to be there.
How many of you are planning to vote for Vice President Harris in November? I want to dive into exactly why that is. Linda, and then Kathy, why are you supporting Vice President Harris for president?
I've first voted for Reagan in '80 as well. And all of my voting years, I was told character counts. And as I look at Donald Trump, I either have to say character counts and not vote for him, or say it doesn't count anymore. I did vote for him in 2016. I voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and I will vote for Kamala Harris this year.
That's interesting that you voted for Trump, then Biden, now you're going to vote for Harris. These are very different people. What is driving your decision now?
I have listened to Kamala Harris and the things she has to say. I truly believe she cares about people. I think her life shows she cares about people. And she truly wants to work to make our day in and day out lives better now. And I care about now, but I have grandchildren, and I care about what kind of a world we're going to give them to build on as they become people to vote in the next few years. And again, I go back to character counts, and Donald Trump is a proven liar. He has said and done too many things that I think should be disqualifying, from January 6th to those poor people in Springfield, Ohio. They must just be terrified.
Kathy, you're in Pennsylvania. Why are you voting for Vice President Harris?
I hear and see the fears that people have just contemplating another 4 years with Donald Trump. I don't have anything that I can think of that I would say I agree with him on. And I, like Linda, would say, to me, character counts. So Donald Trump is a no for me.
What about you, Mauricio? You are joining us from Wisconsin.
January 6th to me is beyond unacceptable. That's sacred territory that was stormed. He riled up that. It was not a protest. That was an insurrection. The plans were to overthrow a legitimate election. That will never be tolerated in my viewpoint.
Do you believe that Vice President Harris, if she is elected president, that she will be very different from Joe Biden? Or do you see her continuing the issues and agenda that he has pursued for the past 4 years?
I'm sure she's probably a little bit more liberal, but she would accept the results if she lost. And that's big to me.
Linda, back to the original question I asked Mauricio as well. As a Harris supporter, do you believe that the vice president would continue Joe Biden's policies, or do you think she has a different vision for the country?
I think she will do some of the things President Biden has done. And some of the things Biden has done has helped our country quite a bit. I would like to hear more specifics of what she plans to do, but I would much rather see someone want to give tax breaks to the middle class than the most wealthy people in our country, which is what Trump wants to do.
I just wanted to follow up on this idea of how future President Harris might or may not be different than President Biden. And I'll be honest with you, I do not envy Kamala Harris because she has to defend President Biden, and she also has to kind of thread the needle of following his policies, maybe making some of her own. But listen, there have been some failures in this administration, and I think whether you're on the left or the right, you can hopefully see that. And for me, some of those things off the top of my head were we did not have a good withdrawal from Afghanistan. Prices are through the roof for consumers, and we can debate how we got at that. But at the end of the day, inflation is out of control, and there have been a record number of illegal border crossings under the Biden administration. And so I understand that she has to appeal to the base and she doesn't want to alienate any Biden voters. But it's very shocking to me that there's not one thing that she could think of that she would have done differently than President Biden.
Show of hands, who is concerned about the issue of abortion and reproductive health care going into this election? Okay. Mary, you're not raising your hand. You live in a state where abortion access is currently permitted up to 15 weeks. You're good with that where it is? It's not a motivating factor for you, even though abortion will be on the ballot in Arizona?
The way I feel is that I'm more concerned about women's health. And I think that we need to concentrate on prevention of unplanned pregnancies, not using abortion as birth control. That's the way I feel. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I think that that's what it should be. I think 17 weeks is a good amount of time. Now, of course, just like everyone else had said, rape, incest, problems with the pregnancy, things like that. Of course, I can understand having an abortion and you find out later in your pregnancy that something's wrong with the baby. Okay, that's a different story.
Would you, Mary, like to hear candidate Donald Trump and candidate J.D. Vance echo your beliefs? They avoid talking about the specifics. You were very specific at 17 weeks. Would you like the candidates to be that specific?
At the federal level, and the reason why it was brought back to the states is that different states have different feelings. California is much more liberal than Arizona or Texas or Oklahoma or Georgia or other areas of the country. And just like Trump said, look at Kansas. Kansas has become more liberal than they used to be. Mm-hmm. And that's very true. But the main focus is women's health. Women and what's taught in schools, nothing anymore.
Kathy, you raised your hand that this is an issue that's important to you.
It is. I have daughters and granddaughters, and I would hope that the decision of something that serious would be allowed to be made by them and their healthcare provider, not by someone sitting on a bench or in a boardroom or wherever, making that decision for them to be able to or not to be able to control their own body. And it's not realistic to believe if you like this liberal law better, everyone can just move where they want to. Those things just aren't realistic.
You can see the extended interview on our YouTube page or our website. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.